When women were scared, men said not all men. But then the victims were all men, and suddenly everyone was a suspect. Before we begin, please like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Let's all be internet friends. We used to hear it all the time, that familiar refrain, a quiet shield against the very real fears women carried. Not all men. It was uttered in defense, in exasperation, whenever the conversation turned to the shadows, the threats, the constant vigilance. It was a comfortable truth for some, a painful dismissal for others. But then, something shifted. A cold dread began to creep into the city, an unease that felt strangely familiar, yet profoundly new. It started subtly, a tremor beneath the surface of everyday life, a tightening of the air that everyone felt, but no one could quite explain. And it was in this unsettling atmosphere that the first quiet detail emerged, a crack in the comfortable facade of how we understood safety. The initial call came in on a Tuesday, late morning. Not with the frantic urgency of a major incident, but with the quiet, routine tone of a confirmed fatality. Detective Jules Avery, her eyes already scanning the detailed notes on her tablet, felt the familiar thrum of an investigation beginning. The body was discovered in a modest sedan, parked neatly on a quiet residential street, not far from a local park where joggers usually clustered. It wouldn't make national news, not yet. The scene itself was eerily calm. No shattered glass, no overturned belongings, no sign of a struggle. The victim was simply there. Their phone was in their pocket, wallet untouched in the center console. The initial report noted no motive and no forced entry. It was as if they had simply pulled over, settled in, and then ceased to be. Avery knelt by the car door, her gaze lingering on the peaceful, almost serene, expression. It was the quiet details that always bothered her the most. The things that didn't fit, the lack of a story in the chaos. This one had a void where the violence should have been, a silent anomaly that pricked at the edges of her experience. She ran a gloved hand along the car's clean exterior. Too neat. Too quiet. The first news reports were brief, local. A discovery, a police investigation. But in the hushed corners of the city's digital landscape, a different narrative was already taking root. Group chats started to light up, quick-fire questions and half-formed theories bouncing between screens. Twitter threads, initially speculative, began to bloom with a nervous energy, linking this quiet incident to a low hum of unease that had been building for months. Samira West, perched on a stool behind the gleaming espresso machine at the daily grind, felt the subtle tremor. Her phone buzzed with a message from her roommate, a single, stark warning that resonated deep in their shared history. Don't walk home alone tonight. It wasn't about this specific incident yet. It was about the air, the feeling, the cumulative weight of stories women swapped every day. The news reports mentioned a person, gender still unconfirmed, but instinct whispered a specific fear, a familiar, chilling logic. The quiet details of the crime, the lack of struggle, suggested something insidious, something that preyed on unguarded moments. And in those early hours, the fear, unspoken but universally understood, began to spread, woman to woman, like an electric current. The second incident hit less than a week later, chillingly similar in its quiet terror. This time, the discovery was made by a neighbor, drawn by an unusual silence from the usually bustling apartment next door. The victim was found in their own home, no signs of forced entry, no struggle, just the unsettling stillness of an unnatural end. The official reports were still vague, referring only to a person found deceased. At the city's busiest emergency room, Layla Kim, a nurse whose exhaustion was perpetually etched around her eyes, scanned the ER chart. She'd seen enough trauma to recognize the signs of violence, but this case, like the first, lacked the usual hallmarks. The notes were terse, cause of death suspected poisoning, and below it the chilling detail, no signs of a break-in. Just stopped breathing. Layla felt a shiver run down her spine. The victim's name was on the chart, a young professional, someone who'd seemingly lived a quiet life. She imagined them at home, perhaps unwinding after a long day, never suspecting a threat that entered without force, leaving no trace but a sudden, final silence. It was the insidious nature of it that gnawed at her, the idea that safety within your own walls could be so effortlessly breached. The news of the second, equally quiet death rippled through the city, not with a roar, but with a pervasive chill. It was an unspoken alarm, particularly among women. Plans that had been made days ago began to unravel. A casual text, "Are we still on for Friday?" would often be met with a hesitant, "Actually, thinking of staying in tonight." Bars and restaurants, usually buzzing with easy laughter, saw a subtle rearrangement of their patrons. Women, almost instinctively, started to sit closer to each other, their conversations lowering in volume, their eyes doing a quick sweep of the room before settling. The usual late-night solo walks were swapped for hurried Uber rides, even for short distances. Olivia Stein, a therapist whose office was usually a sanctuary of controlled emotions, observed the shift firsthand. Her clients, predominantly women, began speaking faster during their sessions, their narratives punctuated by nervous glances towards the door or the window. They talked about a new kind of vigilance. "I keep looking over my shoulder," one client confessed, her voice tight, "even during the day." Another spoke of canceling her evening run, feeling a tightness in her chest she couldn't explain. Olivia noted the collective anxiety, the way fear, once a quiet hum in the background of their lives, was now moving to the forefront, demanding attention, changing behavior, and subtly, yet profoundly, reshaping their sense of safety in the world. The shift, subtle at first, began to register in the male consciousness, not as fear for themselves, but as a perplexing change in the women around them. They noticed the canceled plans, the hurried goodbyes, the way eyes now quickly assessed them, rather than simply meeting their gaze. It was a new, uncomfortable distance. Daniel Cross, the gym trainer, radiating an easy confidence that usually drew people in, felt it acutely. After a late-night class, he offered a female coworker a ride home, a gesture he considered polite, even chivalrous. She hesitated, her smile tightening, before politely but firmly declining, mumbling something about calling a taxi. Daniel's usual affability curdled into irritation. He drove home stewing, the slight stinging more than it should have. He slammed his car door, muttering to the empty street, "You all act like I'm dangerous just for existing." It wasn't about the individual crime, he thought. It was about this sudden, irrational blanket suspicion that seemed to encompass every man, including him. The air was thick with an unspoken accusation, and he, for the first time, felt its weight. The growing distance, the perceived unfairness, began to coalesce into a public outcry from men. Social media, ever the amplifier, became their battleground. Hashtags like "Not All Men" started trending, quickly followed by parodies, sarcastic memes, and short skits depicting exaggerated male heartbreak over perceived female paranoia. The online world became saturated with images of men holding signs, feigning tears, or dramatically clutching their chests in mock offense. Victor Lang, the influencer whose social media presence was built on a foundation of confident, sometimes abrasive, alpha masculinity, seized the moment. He posted a video from his perfectly lit studio, his face a mask of feigned concern, subtly mocking what he called female hysteria. He paced, gesticulated, and delivered lines like, "So, I guess now every guy is a potential monster, huh? Because of reasons?" His smirk was barely concealed as he talked about needing to prove himself safe just to walk down the street. The video, expertly edited and timed, exploded. Within hours, it had racked up 100K views, thousands of likes, and a torrent of comments echoing his sentiments. It was a digital roar of male indignation, completely missing the undercurrent of genuine fear that had sparked the whole thing. The public backlash, fueled by online mockery, only sharpened the collective anxiety felt by women. The dismissive tone grated on nerves already frayed by a fear that felt both old and disturbingly new. Layla Kim, perpetually under pressure in the ER, found her patience wearing thin. She'd spent countless shifts dealing with genuine emergencies, and now, the underlying hum of societal tension was creeping into her professional space. One afternoon, a male patient, a young man with a sprained ankle, tried to make light of the situation. He chuckled, a forced, uncomfortable sound, and joked about needing protection from crazy women these days, echoing the online narratives. Layla felt something inside her snap. The exhaustion of her job, combined with the simmering frustration of living with a constant, low-grade fear, erupted. She looked at him, her gaze piercing, all pretense of professional detachment gone. Her voice was low, laced with years of unspoken experience. "Try walking home with your keys between your fingers for 10 years, she said, the words cutting through the sterile air of the examination room. Try checking your back seat before you get in your car. Try having your phone on speed dial for an emergency every single night just in case. Then come talk to me about needing protection." The patient's smile faltered, replaced by a stunned, uncomfortable silence. Layla didn't wait for a response. She just turned, the weight of her words hanging in the air, and walked away. The tension, thick and palpable, wasn't confined to online debates or ER examination rooms. It permeated everyday interactions, especially for women navigating public spaces. Samira West experienced it firsthand at her job, behind the familiar counter of the daily grind. The usual morning rush was a blur of caffeine and hurried pleasantries, but a new edge had crept into some of the customer interactions. One afternoon, a man she recognized as a regular, someone who usually just mumbled his order, leaned across the counter. His voice was low, but his tone was laced with an aggressive curiosity. "What's with you women lately?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Why are you all suddenly so rude?" He gestured vaguely, encompassing the unspoken atmosphere that had settled over the city. Samira met his gaze, her usual barista smile replaced by a flat, unyielding expression. The years of quiet vigilance, of sizing up every approaching figure, of the internal calculus of safety, coalesced into a single, direct response. Her voice was calm, clear, and utterly unapologetic. "We're not rude," she said, the words cutting through the aroma of roasted coffee. "We're alert." She held his gaze for another beat, letting the truth of it sink in before turning to call out the next order. The man, taken aback, mumbled something incoherent and stepped away, leaving the space around the counter humming with a different kind of energy. The quiet, insidious nature of the previous incidents was shattered by the third discovery. This time, the victim wasn't found silently in a car or a private apartment. This time, it happened in broad daylight, on a bustling street, near a crowded market. The details were stark. A person collapsed on the pavement with a single, precise stab wound. No struggle reported, no shouts heard. Just a sudden, shocking fall. The incident exploded into the public consciousness. The police couldn't contain it, couldn't keep the vague reports from becoming a concrete, horrifying reality. Detective Avery watched the security footage repeatedly, the grainy images looping on her screen. The victim, a person in their late 30s, had been walking along, seemingly unconcerned. Then, a figure obscured by the crowd and a sudden glare had moved in close, a swift, almost imperceptible motion. The victim fell. The figure melted back into the flow of pedestrians, their face too dark, too far, too blurred to identify. Avery leaned closer to the screen, her brow furrowed. The blur wasn't just a technical glitch. It looked intentional, as if the person responsible knew exactly where the cameras were, how to move, how to become invisible in plain sight. This wasn't random. It was a calculated act, delivered with chilling precision in the most public of spaces. The public stabbing forced the police's hand. The quiet investigations, the veiled reports, were no longer sustainable. The city was on edge, a low hum of collective anxiety building into a fever pitch. The police chief, alongside Detective Avery, stood before a bank of microphones, the flashing cameras illuminating their grim faces. The air crackled with anticipation as the spokesperson began to read from a prepared statement, confirming the details of the 3 fatalities. Then came the stark, shattering revelation. "After thorough investigation and forensic analysis," the spokesperson announced, their voice unwavering, "we can confirm that all 3 victims are men." A collective gasp rippled through the press corps. The fact that all victims were male, a detail carefully guarded until now, hit with the force of a physical blow. "Furthermore," the spokesperson continued, "all suspects remain unknown. We believe this is deliberate, possibly coordinated." The words hung in the air, transforming the city's nebulous fear into a sharp, undeniable reality. The implicit narrative, the one whispered in group chats and felt in nervous glances, had been utterly inverted. The victims were not who everyone assumed they would be. And suddenly, the predator became something far more unsettling. The news hit like a cold front, sweeping across every screen, every conversation, every perception. The collective gasp in the press room was just the beginning. On social media, the rapid-fire memes and parodies of male heartbreak abruptly ceased. The cacophony of not all men posts went eerily quiet. It was as if the entire digital world had suddenly frozen, caught in the headlights of an unthinkable truth. Men, who had been vocal in their indignation, seemed to visibly deflate, their confident stances dissolving into a palpable unease. In her calm, sunlit office, Olivia Stein reread the transcript of the police press conference. Twice, the words, "all victims are men," resonated with a profound, almost devastating irony. She closed her eyes for a moment, picturing the shift in the city's unspoken power dynamic. They'll feel it now, she thought, a quiet, somber observation. Not with a sense of triumph, but with the chilling recognition of a lesson brutally delivered. For the first time, men across the city were experiencing the visceral, ever-present hum of fear that women had navigated their entire lives. The world hadn't just paused, it had inverted. The digital roar that Victor Lang had so carefully cultivated evaporated into a profound silence. The news, stark and undeniable, had pierced his carefully constructed echo chamber. His usual bravado, his quick-witted mockery, seemed utterly out of place in this new, chilling reality. Within hours of the police report, his active feeds went dark. He quietly deleted his viral videos mocking female hysteria, the parodies of not all men, and any tweet that could be construed as dismissive of fear. His podcast, usually a weekly diatribe on alpha living, was abruptly canceled, a terse message about unforeseen circumstances replacing his usual bombastic intro. But the silence wasn't just public. It seeped into his private life. He found himself staring at old contacts, a profound unease settling in. He pulled up his ex-girlfriend's number, a woman he dismissed as overly sensitive during their breakup. Hesitantly, he typed out a message, a raw, uncharacteristic question born of a dawning, uncomfortable understanding. "Were you ever afraid of me?" The message sent, he waited, his phone clutched in his hand. But the ellipsis never turned to text. She didn't reply. The silence on the other end was louder than any of his former boasts. The news that the victims were all men and the chilling implication of a coordinated attack had a profound effect on Eli Grant. As a tech consultant, he prided himself on his logical, analytical mind, his ability to assess risks and build solutions. But this new reality defied his comfortable frameworks. The confidence he exuded in meetings, the subtle entitlement he rarely acknowledged, began to fray at the edges. His usual calm was replaced by a gnawing anxiety. At home, he found himself compulsively checking his locks, double-bolting the door, peering through the peephole before answering. Dinners out became strained, his eyes darting nervously around the room. On a recent date, a woman offered him a sip of her water, and he hesitated, a flash of suspicion darting through his mind. He mumbled an excuse, subtly pushing the glass away. The fear, which he'd only ever heard women discuss, was now a cold, personal companion. He started asking leading questions of his friends, his voice betraying a new tremor. "Do I seem like the type of guy who'd get targeted?" he'd ask, trying to couch it as a theoretical query. He was no longer just worried about the city, he was worried about himself, seeing potential threats in every shadow, every unfamiliar face. The world, which had always felt designed for his comfort and safety, suddenly seemed unpredictable and dangerous, a stark reversal of everything he'd ever known. The city's new atmosphere of fear wasn't just a psychological burden. It began to alter routines. Daniel Cross, who had always prided himself on his self-sufficiency and strength, found his usual solitary evening runs increasingly unsettling. The empty streets after dusk, once a haven for clearing his head, now felt menacing, every shadow a potential threat. The confidence that had once defined him began to chip away, replaced by a cautious, almost desperate need for company. He started reaching out to his gym buddies, suggesting group runs, something he'd rarely bothered with before. Initially, it was just a casual invite, but soon it became a necessity. He'd text the group chat, "Anyone out tonight? Don't want to hit the trails solo." The unspoken reason hung in the air, a shared understanding of the new vulnerability that had settled over them all. One evening, after a particularly tense run where they'd all jumped at a sudden noise, he wiped sweat from his brow, his voice gruff but earnest, confessing to his friends, "I'm just being smart." The words were meant to sound pragmatic, a sensible precaution, but beneath them was the undeniable tremor of a man who was, for the first time, truly afraid of the dark. The seismic shift in the city's sense of safety created a new kind of demand, and Olivia Stein's therapy practice felt the tremors firsthand. Her waiting room, once primarily filled with women seeking support for navigating a world that often felt unsafe, now saw an equal, if not greater, number of men. They came in, initially hesitant, then desperate, to articulate a fear they had rarely, if ever, had to confront. Men spoke about the visceral unease of walking alone at night, the sudden awareness of shadows, the chilling feeling of being watched. They described checking their rearview mirrors compulsively, double-checking locks, and the new, uncomfortable realization that their perceived invincibility was an illusion. And as these men articulated their fear, Olivia noticed a fascinating phenomenon. The women clients, listening in group sessions, or even just observing the societal shift, began to talk about the irony. Olivia meticulously documented the crossover in her journal. "This is the first time they've ever listened," she wrote, observing how the shared experience of vulnerability, however sudden for one group, finally bridged a long-standing chasm of understanding. The conversations in her office were no longer theoretical. They were raw, immediate, and painfully real, revealing the stark truth of how fear had always shaped half the population, a truth now finally being felt, and thus listened to by the other. The growing unease found a new, chilling voice. On a desolate corner of the internet, a video appeared, shared first in obscure forums, then rapidly mirroring across mainstream platforms. The figure on screen was a blurred silhouette, their voice deliberately distorted, mechanical, and genderless. This wasn't a rant or a mockery, it was a cold, calculating statement. The figure, identified only as Theo in the video's cryptic title, spoke with an unnerving calm. Their words were chosen with precision, devoid of overt threats, yet heavy with implication. "This isn't revenge," the distorted voice droned, echoing in the quiet spaces of countless viewers' homes. "It's reflection." The video showed no violence, only abstract patterns, unsettling imagery, and a creeping sense of inevitability. It implied a methodical purpose, a deliberate unraveling of societal norms, turning the fear women had lived with into a mirror for men to gaze into. It was a declaration, not of war, but of a calculated social experiment, and its chilling effectiveness rippled through the populace. Theo's video wasn't the only thing spreading. Soon after, a new, even more disturbing element emerged from the depths of the internet: a map. It wasn't an official police graphic, but a user-generated compilation, meticulously plotting the locations of all 3 deaths. What made it chilling was not just the pinpoints, but the shape they formed when connected, a distinct spiral. A slow, outward coil. The image went viral, sparking a fresh wave of theories and dread. Was it a signature? A taunt? A promise of more to come? The question hung heavy in the digital air. Samira West, scrolling through her feed at home, watched as her roommate's eyes widened, fixated on the glowing screen. "Someone's playing with us," her roommate whispered, the fear in her voice stark and real. The map wasn't just a grim data visualization. It was a deliberate, calculated message, a game board laid bare, and it made the anonymous threat feel terrifyingly personal. The escalating panic, fueled by Theo's chilling video and the viral spiral map, brought the full weight of the media down on Detective Jules Avery. Her quiet composure was tested daily by a relentless barrage of questions, particularly from the more sensationalist outlets. The underlying implication of every query was clear, even if unspoken. During a particularly tense press conference, A reporter, emboldened by the speculative fervor online, finally vocalized the unspoken question. "Detective Avery," they called out, their voice sharp and probing, "given the victims' profiles and the nature of these attacks, is the killer a woman?" Avery met their gaze, her expression unreadable. She paused for a beat, letting the loaded question hang in the air, allowing its inherent bias to resonate. When she spoke, her voice was calm, clear, and utterly dismissive of the gendered framing. "Would it matter if it was?" she countered, her eyes sweeping across the assembled faces. The question was a challenge, a subtle redirection that forced them to confront the underlying assumption. It wasn't about the gender of the perpetrator, she implied, but the nature of the fear and who was now feeling it. The shift in the city's atmosphere was palpable, a suffocating blanket of anxiety that settled heaviest on men. The once casual anonymity of public spaces now felt charged with a new kind of tension. On a crowded subway car, during the evening commute, the pressure finally cracked. A man, disheveled and wild-eyed, suddenly stood up amidst the packed commuters. His voice, raw with fear and resentment, sliced through the usual drone of the train. "Women did this," he shrieked, his eyes darting frantically around the car, landing on the stunned female faces. "They're making us pay. They're getting their revenge." Layla Kim, on her way home from another grueling shift, looked up from her phone. She stared at him, her gaze cool and steady, devoid of surprise, filled only with a profound, weary understanding. The decades of living with a quiet, constant threat, the invisible burden of vigilance, gave her words a weight that silenced the agitated man, and indeed, the entire subway car. Her voice was low, but every word resonated with a chilling clarity. "We lived through centuries," she said, holding his gaze. "You're panicking over weeks." The man's rant died in his throat, replaced by a stunned, exposed silence. The city had changed. The initial shock had given way to a grim new normal, an uncomfortable equilibrium. The frantic pace of life hadn't stopped, but the rhythm had shifted. The streets, once divided by invisible lines of perceived safety, were now subtly, chillingly even. No one walked alone anymore, not if they could help it. Shared rides, hurried walks in pairs, or simply staying indoors after dark became the default. The familiar clinking of keys, once almost exclusively a sound made by women gripping them defensively between their fingers, now echoed from the hands of men too. A constant, sharp reminder of their new vulnerability. In her quiet office, Olivia Stein made the final entry in her journal. She documented the new anxieties, the changed behaviors, the raw conversations she'd witnessed. There was no triumph in her observations, no sense of vindication, just a profound, unsettling clarity. She closed her journal, the pen poised over the last line. "This is what equality feels like," she wrote, the words heavy with a truth that no one could now deny, and no one's smiling. The fear was no longer gendered, it was universal. And in that shared apprehension, a harsh, unexpected form of understanding had finally emerged. Thank you for watching. Please do not forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. I love you all.